for a long time. And I think we've learned a lot of lessons that other states and jurisdictions are just improving upon. I can tell you that when we started, we didn't have a lot to go on, but what we knew for sure was that there had been harms, and those harms needed to be repaired, and that we needed to give people who wanted to be in the industry, who had been harmed, the tools to be on the same level as everyone else, and to have a chance. So that's kind of how we defined it. But I think you've seen a lot of different models, depending on whether you're focusing on technical assistance or exclusivity, which is something that Massachusetts is unique to, which I'm very proud of, which we actually just expanded last week. Maybe I'll just briefly describe that, and then I'll open it up to others. So after 3 or 4 years, with the help of a lot of activists and affected stakeholders and people at every level of government, we took a license that is similar to what California calls a non storefront retailer model. And we made that exclusive to people from disproportionately harmed communities, or those who would economically empower those communities for 3 years. That just got extended to 3 years. And my hope is that that exclusivity, that time, and then the tools and assistance that you need will add up together to make what we're all hoping for in terms of equity.
That's so dope. Kat, I know you are out in Los Angeles, and we can attribute California and Nina starting and putting a footprint from social equity perspective. Would love to hear, from you, Nina and Kat, your perspective on, I guess, the evolution of the word, the terminology, and why do we sometimes have challenges of, as an industry, of trying to define it? It seems it's pretty complex. In your opinion?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to hear. I think one of the first questions that you had asked was kind of, where are we in this space? And I think if we look around right now, we know exactly where we are, in the sense that there have been these inequities that need to be addressed systematically. All we have to do is turn on the news or walk outside to know the harms that have persisted and continue to exist in communities. And what we know is that our cannabis policies are outdated. They don't work. They caused harm from the beginning, and they continue to cause harm. And through these equity programs, we have an opportunity to proactively acknowledge that harm. And once we acknowledge that harm, it's not enough for us to say, okay, that's fine. We have to work to address that harm. And the harms are economic. There are health impacts. There are impacts to entire economies and families. And so I think that we started this conversation, most of us as regulators in this space, the primary focus, or at least the initial focus, has been on allowing folks to have access to licensing opportunities, because as regulators, one of our primary responsibilities is through our licensing and regulatory authority. But I'm excited that regulators in this space and governments in this space are starting to think critically about opportunities and ways to address inequities beyond licensing. Because I've said this from the beginning, even if we create thousands of opportunities for businesses in the city of Los Angeles, which we will, that is not enough to address the harm. And again, absolutely related to the harms that we're seeing happening on streets today. And so I think that's part of the reason why we're doing this. It can be a slow process. This doesn't happen overnight. I know that folks who are in this space and who are leading these conversations face challenges every single day. And it takes a collective effort at every single level of government, between private agencies and government agencies, to get this done. But this is part of our responsibility, because we can no longer say that we don't know. We know.
Absolutely.
Right. So what's up, everybody? Nina Parks. I'm coming from Ramaytush, Ohlone territory, also known as San Francisco, California. So part of social justice and social equity is also trying to practice land acknowledgements for peoples that have been occupied, like that we actually are settlers on their space. So also trying to put that into my practice. So Ohlone territory representing here. So social, I think one of the questions, right, was to define social equity and what does that mean? So for me, in the work that we've been doing out here, social equity means trying to get to a parity for everybody, no matter what color their skin is or what variable that they have that is uncontrollable to themselves, has the right to be human. Right. I think that in a very like broad sense, that's what it is. Right. And we have laws and policies and authorities that have been empowered to create a world based on bias, right, and on prejudice and isms that can be controlled. Right. The things that people are being persecuted for or being oppressed for are things that are uncontrollable, whereas people's behaviors and the way that we choose to act as authority and use power in the world is something that we have choice on, right? So our social equity policies and the work is to really be intentional about how we choose to implement power and how we choose to heal from the way that power is implemented on us. Right. So the policies that are that we're working towards, and it's really difficult, right? Because it's like moving through, you know, the way that people were socialized, the way that people were empowered to act in a space and to hold power. We're trying to like undo a lot of that learning and then reconstruct it. So yes, there's going to take time. It's going to take different iterations, and implementation is kind of like a fumbly process, but we are seeing a lot of improvements and we are seeing a lot of headway. And the fact that we're even on this call is True. Evolution, you know, so really, really empowered by that, and seeing everybody's faces is super empowering. And it is a transformative justice and restorative justice strategy. Right. And people need to remember that this is a strategy moving forward. And so we have to actively participate in the implementation of it. So that's my 2 cents about that.
Absolutely.
Right. I also really quickly just wanted to piggyback Nina, because I think she was speaking so much truth around the broadness of it. So just, you know, all power and respect to Shalene and Kat, because when you get into an industry like cannabis, where the laws and the regulatory frameworks are specifically set up to prevent certain groups from participating, you have to attack acutely what's at play. And so a lot of the initial work that they've done that we've built on has been very focused on the licensing piece. And, you know, in some ways that has been co-opted into the new affirmative action. But when you hear what Nina was saying, is that generally speaking, social equity is not just about cannabis. It's about having equitable access and equitable policies for all areas of government. And based on just our white supremacist culture, male-dominated, heteronormative culture, basically we've been normalized that that's actually not the way that we should govern. And that's not the way we should run businesses even, right? And I think we've had to kind of walk a lot of that back and unlearn a lot of the things that we've been conditioned with. And for some people, it feels like, oh, well, you are now deliberately helping this group. And sort of this is where my logic starts to come into play. And I'm like, well, if we've deliberately for centuries marginalized, and definitely within the last 40 to 80 years, it's been a strategy to incarcerate and therefore set back communities so significantly. Like, real talk, our biggest leaders of change are still talking about those issues, yet none of them talking about cannabis legalization. So we can get into that, but they're still talking about those issues. And really, cannabis prohibition was the tool to maintain this systemic racism. We have now just a continuous story that we can tell there. Yes, then we have to be deliberate. We have to be intentional, because in some some ways we're triaging a situation that the cannabis industry has now made an emergency, right? It's an
Right.
emergency because we created laws and regulatory frameworks that did not have that intention. And so I feel really blessed that in this movement, in this time of now, that I'm following people like Shalene and Kat, learning from their triumphs, learning from the mistakes that have happened, and sort of just trying to figure out how do we capitalize on those insights to start to come together more collectively, be more of a chorus around what we believe social equity is. And yes, at the smallest level, it is impacting that individual and restitution. But we got to restore the community in which they were built in, and that they were bred in. I'm born of the tribe, I'm of the tribe. And so we've got to restore the tribe. And then we've also got to then reinvest, because that gap, just for Black folks, 60 cents on the dollar for every white dollar that is being earned, that gap exists because of cannabis prohibition. And so now we have to do a lot of triaging to close the gap. And that's what I feel is the broader look on social equity.
Awesome.
And I was going to say, I think you said something very important, and it actually brings me to a question for Molly. I know that you all just recently implemented some social equity standards there in Colorado. So for a place like that, which is one of the most robust and robust markets that's well established, how do you, take a market that's been up and going for so long and now implement these things like Dashita and Nina are talking about into the system as you move forward?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think going back to one of your original questions around why it's so important to include this in legislation, I think Colorado is the perfect example of why it's so important, because if we don't address it now, we're going to build the system like we have built it in Colorado. And, we've done our research and we know who is, running the industry here in Colorado. And so we want to be able to change that a little bit. Or a lot. And so, yeah, Colorado passed some bills in 2019, creating an accelerator license. And right now they're going through the process of defining a social equity applicant. They're in rulemaking, so we don't know the final outcome yet. But what that means for us here in Denver is that we really want to be able to take the work that they're doing and build off of that by also then sorry, I'm getting a little distraction here from my son. So we also want to build off of that and take the definition of a social equity applicant and do what Shailene was referring to, which was, making those licenses in Denver exclusively available to social equity applicants. So we're working through those details as well, and are also going to figure out how to roll that out. We've also been doing other things, not just focusing on licensing, but also looking at other programs. Since the very beginning, we've been taking marijuana tax revenue and allocating it to after-school programs and other types of programs that assist with those types of social equity programs, and then also the expungement program that we've done here in Denver as well.
So, Molly, I got kind of piggybacking on your statement. How do you also protect your intention by making sure some of the larger companies and some of the people that come and try to take advantage of an opportunity, and we've seen those challenges, and and this might be a Molly question or it could be for everyone else, for Kat and Shailene, and what have been your challenges of making sure that the system itself that you're trying to build is not taken advantage of? Because that's the feedback that we get a lot of times from members are saying, like, we have this program, but I feel like it's not for me. I can't get access. Everyone that should not be a part of it, some kind of way, figure out how to get a part of it. Or like in Oakland, Cheney, where you had Black people, you had social equity applicants called CHIPs, because you had general applicants that would go around and look for individual people to put on their application to strengthen it. And they basically built their own brand and left the social equity applicants behind, and they're still holding permits and not really, not even seeing the promise of the opportunity.
Yeah, can I jump in real quick on this one? So,
Yes.
America has a huge inequity in education, period, for people of color, right? So that is the number one thing, right? Is the ability for individuals to be educated with enough language, examples. Like we don't have apprenticeship programs. We don't have a lot of active learning spaces where an individual, especially an equity applicant, would like be armed enough with enough language and enough skill sets to know when they're being taken advantage of. Because $250,000 sounds really interesting for me to write my name on an application.
Right.
I don't have to do anything else. I don't have to do anything else. Cool. Throw me $250,000. You know, sounds amazing, especially in this economic climate. But little do they know that they can actually build generational wealth. We don't talk about that at dinner tables. We don't talk about generational wealth amongst our friend groups. It's taboo to talk about money in social circles. So really that around not having that conversation as a regular piece of how to navigate has created the ability for people to take advantage. And the thing that sucks even more is that people know that and they will take advantage of it, right? So in regard, and this is where I would love to hear from a lot of the other regulators is how do we as people in positions of power create safeguards, right? Because that's the idea for government, is to be able to be the referee in that area. So what have you done and what can we still do?
Yeah.
I think exploitation has been an issue in cannabis since the beginning, especially exploitation of Black and brown people in this industry. Like Nina said, you have some people that enter the space that might not have the experience, or the acumen to really understand what the language of some of these contracts, really mean. Also, in states like California, in cities like Oakland, which is expensive to live in, even more expensive to start a cannabis business, right? Sure. And so a license is only one part of it. If you don't have the financial literacy, and also if you don't have the foundation of having some wealth to start off with, you're not being set up for success. And from what we have all seen and experienced, a lot of these general applicants aren't coming from places of integrity to build with the social equity applicants that they're partnering with, furthering exploiting people.
Right.
I remember a few years ago at an NCIA panel, actually, we were discussing this particular issue, and there was talks of maybe, penalizing general applicants who are exploiting their equity applicants. Personally, I don't feel that equity people should have to depend on general, applicants. That shouldn't have to be, an option. Equity is supposed to be setting us up to be empowered for success, right? And so it should be more of a local and state, and when it goes to federal, like a federal responsibility to provide, these resources. I know that, Oakland has been taking some steps into making sure that, certain equity applicants can, be empowered. There's just been, a grant for an equity kitchen for manufacturers to use, which is really good, because that's been a long time issue for people finding the actual space that they need to manufacture, their products, and there should be other, assistance by way of loans. Of course, I don't believe that grants is a form, of social equity, but really empowering people with the financial assistance that they really need, realistically. Right before we start even talking about building financial wealth. You can't build financial wealth with $200,000. That's not going to, better our communities. And so we need to have some really substantial loans and not loans, I'm sorry, grants, more grants that's readily available through cities and states for some of these social equity applicants.
Great.
Right. And oh, go ahead, Shailene.
Shailene, yeah, because
Thank
you guys, because Shailene, just before you go, because you guys had a situation where it wasn't social equity, but you had a situation where even the diversity and equity and community engagement plans, if people were not adhering to them, that there was a license that was either penalized or what have you. But I would love to get your feedback, Shailene.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing we've learned is if you submit a plan that has to do with diversity or positive impact, you have to be held to your own standards of following through on your plan. So that's absolutely something that we check and is a requirement of renewal going forward. But I wanted to speak to the aspect of kind of limiting domination and exploitation in a state. I think particularly on the East Coast, that is the most crucial aspect that I could share for other states, both legally and culturally. And I mentioned culturally because on the East Coast, there is serious stigma here. Even though we have very high cannabis use in Massachusetts, we haven't had dispensaries being part of our neighborhoods and culture, like since the 90s, like California. So there is a lot of stigma even among users sometimes. And that just takes years to get over before we're going to see municipalities and other officials treating this like they would any other industry. And so culturally, it's sort of like our movement created another stigma, and that stigma is against greed. Because in other industries, greed is worshipped and billionaires are worshipped. And that's something that we don't want to see repeated. And so by making that a crucial and consistent standard in Massachusetts among activists and consumers and all sorts of people who matter, we were able to create an environment where you don't want to show that you are being greedy because it'll affect your bottom line and it'll affect your reputation. And then legally, we have very strict license caps in Massachusetts. You can't have more than 3 of any type of license. And when companies have tried to test those limits, our agency has put significant resources into stopping them. And that means, investigation and looking into shell companies and taking enforcement actions when we need to. But we've set that example because legally, when you don't allow a company that is very resourced and privileged to dominate the industry from the beginning, then you have a little bit of time and runway to figure out how to help the other companies to start, which is definitely not an easy answer and is going to take some time.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and I'll say expanding on that a little bit, Dashida, I was going to ask, for you, also you're about to answer anyway, but how do you take your experience that you had in corporate America to help inform these types of decisions that you make and, look at that as you're trying to make sure that you can ensure that these people that are operating have the opportunity to build generational wealth as well?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And it kind of is, I'm in the segue because I feel like on the one hand, we definitely need regulatory frameworks that provide access. I've been using as an example the idea of how people go and get their driver's license. I've lived in a lot of different states too, just as and so I judge a state often by the driver's license experience. That is a regulatory process, and it can either be very much facilitated or it can feel like really laborious, right? And in New Jersey, they have the 6 points and they have like a little, I guess, 6-step thing that they hand out, brochure. It's very, it's very much facilitated as a regulatory process. And so one of the reasons I was so excited to join the city of Portland is for a long time, at least 3 or 4 years now, I have been talking about Oregon and talking about Portland and sort of that accessibility. Now, don't get me wrong, every market has their issue. talk about Portland's, but that accessibility, I feel like the barriers are way too high. And granted, I do think that that can often just mean the greedier companies can go a little bit further. But that's why I like this idea of opening up channels like Massachusetts is doing and holding them open only for the licenses or the types of businesses that we know are going to readily diversify the pool. It's sort of like if you have all red marbles and you're trying to get a mix, you're not going to start jumping more red marbles in there. You're looking to try to figure out how do you get that mix. And I think that the barriers have been part of the challenges. There's also cultural challenges. So Portland, despite being one of the more mature markets, still has a lot of canophobia. I feel like I must say this, part of the challenge I really struggle with is getting educated Black folks and educated brown folks to the table. I mean, even though education for some of our community is very much a barrier, real talk, in 2019, we found out that Black women were the most educated group in the country. We're starting businesses at a faster rate, and yet we still have challenges getting into the industry. And what I found is that because the industry is so much more focused on enforcement, it creates these loops and jumps and holes and creates more of the price point barrier for everyone to try to get into. And even with education, we still aren't with the access to that capital. I think Cheney called it out, and she said that loans aren't necessarily going to be what what is going to make equity. I think it's a combination. And I think from my corporate experience, it also doesn't mean that you only want one type of business. Most economies, most industries are really diverse. They're small to really large. You like the large businesses for those price points breaks at the consumer level, but you like that artisan craft experience for something that's a little bit more, that's, for me, it's more individualized and a higher price point potentially, and you're willing to pay for it. That exists so many other places. And the fact that we're missing that and we feel like it has to be either or in the cannabis space is something that I'm constantly bringing to the conversation. For this industry to actually survive, we actually have to start applying typical, I feel like, economic principles that, are applied in other places, not necessarily always perfectly. And that also, and the last point I'll say, is acknowledging that the legacy market is a real economy that with real supply and demand. And essentially what we've done is try to, marginalize that further and further, in some cases over criminalize that or hyper criminalize that segment. But the consumers haven't moved over. And then the competition gets even sharper because you're not making as much money as you thought you were going to make. And I kind of keep going back to newsflash, the consumers haven't moved over because they're still comfortable in the legacy market. The legacy market has better supply, it has a better price point, it's less judgment. You also know that it's diverse. There's so many things we can learn from the legacy market. And I guess I'm trying to encourage us to create regulatory frameworks that facilitate transitioning folks in that market to the legal market. That is how, once you move the consumers over and those businesses, then we start to see us thrive.
I love it.
Exactly. And everything that you said, Dashida, is 100%. And one of the issues as to why we don't have as many allies as we need more allies in the space, people who are not in the industry per se, but consumers and patients and people to really take these conversations and normalize them, right? We're not going to get the support that we need on the federal level unless we can actually educate people on the ground about the importance of social equity. Communities, especially Black and Brown communities that have been harmed, have been conditioned to believe the hype and the stigma around cannabis. But when we actually discuss not only the health benefits, but the economic benefits that can really help our communities, people actually do have a different understanding, right? And we also have to remember that this industry has been made to condition us to believe that cannabis is bad, right? That it does harm our communities. But when we actually talk to our elders and other people about, again, not just the healing aspects, but how it can actually heal our communities, people will jump on board and vote in ways to where we can have more equitable programs and actually get some of this tax revenue into the communities where it needs to go. And so these conversations need to be more normalized and actually taken outside of our inner circles to gain that support.
I also wanted to just quickly say, because I saw that someone said it seems like in any industry, if you aim to do the equity as an add-on, it doesn't work. And in some cases, you have no choice because you're coming in, and that, like in Colorado, real talk, just so much advocacy on the ground just to get them to start acknowledging social equity. Then we have a big movement and a push, and now we have it, right? And we're now defining it. So it's one of those things where we've been literally fighting for that for the last 3 or 4 years, in my opinion. And, this current time period that we're in and this movement means that now it's being added on. I feel like I have the pleasure of leading a team where, from the door, the Portland program was about sensible regulation and equitable practice and sustainability. And it was very loosely defined. And now we get to literally focus on the fact that we can build a regulatory framework that's intentionally meant to deliver on the reparative and restorative opportunities that cannabis legalization can build. That is our mission. And when you have that as the mission, then I think even though you're going through the rigmarole, we do license, we do compliance, we do all of the normal stuff, we can do so still with the mindset that equity and access and education are the foundation for how we want to roll out our programs. I'll also say the last thing, where they put the program is important. A lot of states we have watched year after year get put under liquor usually, which we can talk about that later, but at the end of the day, cannabis is medicine first and always, is not liquor. And then the other area is often taxation or the finance. So it tells you right away what they expect out of the program. In the city of Portland, the cannabis program is housed in the Office of Community and Civic Life. And I think that the difference means that we're looking at what are the impacts to the community. And while revenue continues to be driven, and Oregon is up 112% to LY on the cannabis tax revenue, we're still doing so with the intentionality that we need to drive equity in the space. And that's the foundation. It's really hard, I think, to do that when you're under the Department of Taxation and Revenue or under the OLC or the liquor, commission. It's just hard. And so I feel almost blessed at that opportunity. And my hope is that we can create a benchmark or a model that can say, hey, this can be a regulatory framework, that's the delivery, that's the intention.
Right. I was going to ask a question, and this is for you, Kat, so you can be able to make your point and then answer this question as well. So from a regulator's perspective, we talk about social equity, and we also mention social justice and how they are separate, but also together and entangled. As a regulator, how much do you see your hands touching the social justice issues and aspects when it comes to expungement and looking at laws that are in place right now? And so that's for you, Kat. And I know, say your point and then maybe share. And then of course, Molly and others, please share about the social justice aspect.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I wanted to comment on something that Dashita said about the tax revenue, because I think it's critically important. The questions that you ask in the beginning of why we're legalizing cannabis in the first place, they're going to just drive decision-making later on. And so I get concerned when, regulators and governments are trying to figure out, what they're going to do to solve an economic crisis that they're in. And the response is, let's legalize cannabis. I think that that's absolutely the wrong approach. We can't come into this space trying to figure out how much money we're going to make if we first are acknowledging all the harm that's occurred. That's where that investment has to go. And the reality is that although cannabis is going to be a generator of revenue for government, I think that oftentimes people's eyes get real green and people are expecting all of this revenue right out the gate. And there are costs associated with licensing and regulatory programs. And part of the reason why it takes so long to get our social equity programs up and running is because there are costs associated with running these social equity programs. And if the social equity program is specifically focused on moving folks through a licensing process, then that licensing process itself has to be funded and streamlined. just like Dashida was saying. And so we have the opportunity to amend the procedures themselves that reduce some of the barriers. The folks who have been on today's calls have been highlighting all of the barriers that exist for equity applicants. And the reality is that the cannabis industry as a whole is experiencing barriers because of federal illegality. And those are just compounded experiences that communities on the ground are facing. And so, you know, when the cannabis industry says it has a lack of access to capital, just imagine what those experiences are for folks who have been impacted by the criminal justice system. And so when you ask what the connection is or what the nexus is between social justice and these cannabis policy reforms, I think that the nexus is clear. And I think that that's part of the reason why I'm encouraged by regulators in this space, recognizing that we have an opportunity. Part of our job is to license and regulate, but another part of our job is to advise whatever the governmental body is that's making decisions about health, about how we enforce against unlicensed cannabis activity, about what our educational programs are, so that we reduce stigma, so that we're reducing harm. And I think that particularly right now, the moment that we're in right now, you know, September 1st of 2020, more than ever, we need leadership to acknowledge the harms that folks are experiencing and the nexus between this health crisis that we're experiencing right now and the nexus between the racial injustices that communities are experiencing right now. Cannabis needs to be a part of this conversation. Also a health and economic and enforcement crisis in this country. And so part of the reason why, and I know the folks who have been activists in this space and who come into these roles, part of the reason why we're in this movement and doing this work is because we recognize this nexus. But again, it's going to take this collective effort of us trying to figure out where the inequities exist. And that means that we need to have data. And I can tell you that we're not collecting enough data. We need to be understanding what the demographics are in the industry. We're just starting to collect that information in the state of California. We need to understand what the health impacts are. I'm very curious to know, and I saw a study come out not too long ago, you know, disparities in arrests continue or have increased. Sometimes arrests are increasing. Like folks have mentioned, the cannabis industry wants to see a reduction in illegal activity. So they are lobbying for enforcement. And if we're not having these conversations where we're centering equity, we're going to continue to see inequities. And so I think that folks who are in this space, we benefit a lot by sharing our experiences, and there are lots of lessons learned in this space. And what I would encourage other folks who are in this space and who are doing this work, and the folks who have come on board and are doing this work, is to be comfortable being critical of your own programs. You have to be comfortable being critical of your own programs. That's the only way that we're going to move forward. Folks have to be comfortable, in a sense, being dissatisfied. And I don't think that it's a conflict for us in this space to be proud of the accomplishments that we've made thus far, to be ambitious with the visions that we're setting for these programs, and at the same time walk away completely unsatisfied with where we are today and the work that needs to get done.
Awesome. And then Kat, can you just on the social justice aspect, you said that you're an advisor as well as creating regulations. How is that from the expunging and clearing of records and individuals still being incarcerated? What else can we do what can you do as a regulator, as an advisor, state by state, not only you, but the other regulators as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that we serve as the kind of portal to this apparatus of systems, right?
Right.
Regulators are connected to this government apparatus, and whether it be connecting with, for example, the police chief about enforcement, connecting with directors of public health about how do we acknowledge and identify health disparities. I think that we are a part of this network of folks who are either in power or community leaders, and we have the opportunity to facilitate these conversations. I think that one of the things that we're going to see around the country, and I know that other states have done this already, but for example, right now in the city of Los Angeles, we have this racial equity initiative. The mayor has issued an executive directive on racial equity. And I know that they've recently created a Department of Race and Equity. I know that the city of Oakland has a Department of Race and Equity. So if we work with this Department of Race and Equity to facilitate conversations about how we move forward with different policies to allow us to address things like the disparities that continue to exist, I think that we're going to be able to move this conversation forward. The last point that I want to make, because I have to acknowledge that the city of Los Angeles now has some license exclusivity for our social equity applicants, and it was a hard-fought process to get to this point. And I say it because it's never too late to begin to work on these initiatives. I think it becomes easier if folks are doing it from the beginning. But here in the city of Los Angeles, we just recently went through this comprehensive reform of our cannabis procedures ordinance to make the process more streamlined so that we didn't have as many barriers, to develop a financial grant program so that we can make $5 million intentionally in grants available to social equity applicants, not loans, but intentionally deciding to provide grants to social equity applicants. We've been able to partner with the Los Angeles County Bar Association, and we'll be making legal services available to applicants. So when we have this conversation, and even just particularly about licensing, I know that folks like to say, and this is me being critical of our program, but I know that folks like to say that we have social equity programs. But if your program doesn't allow for access to opportunity, what is that program? If your program is not actually eliminating barriers to allow folks who have been impacted to participate, and because I've heard folks say, well, we have a social equity program and we get 15% off the licensing fee. That's not a social equity program.
Right.
It's not. And sometimes I walk away, looking at our program and knowing that we can and should be doing more. And that's an active process. And I just encourage folks to lean in to get comfortable with the work that needs to be done, because there's no substitute for that work. But the more people you bring into it, the more we're going to be able to get done.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Can I hop in real quick too? So yeah, San Francisco also has an Office of Racial Equity, and a lot of it came from the fact that San Francisco was partnering with a third-party organization called GARE. So GARE is an organization that works with different jurisdictions to build in models of racial equity, inclusion, and inclusion into people's decision-making process. And they have a lot of free like toolkits online. So if you look up GARE, G-A-R-E, you can find a lot of resources on there. The city of San Francisco working on that and having that in different departments, but not having any of the department heads. So like the thing that's interesting, because remember, it's all just people, right? Everybody is just people, right? So if there are holdups or anything, it's because there's people. There might be a regulator in there that's having an argument with their wife. I don't know, you know what I mean? Or their significant other, and they just don't feel like it, and your application doesn't get looked at. Like, this is what's happening in like the Department of like Building Inspection, except for in the Department of Building Inspection, they're also under federal investigation for San Francisco. So there's another thing that we're having to deal with, and like people, they want to they're like little fiefdoms. Like everybody wants to hold on to the power that they have, but they're all just people, right? So San Francisco created the Office of Racial Equity in hopes that not just the Office of Cannabis will have a framework that's built on a racial equity, diversity, and inclusion, but hopefully we can get that framework into all the departments, because before it was just individuals that had the interest or lived in a social, like in social justice community, right, with other people that were going to these workshops or getting this support. But when they went back to the department heads, they didn't take the classes. They weren't in there. So it was hard to like transfer that knowledge from the bottom up, and now San Francisco is trying to weave it through everything. We also finally got our state grants, or are getting our state grants. So we're able to make we decided also grants, not loans. Eventually maybe loans, but grants first, right? So we are allocating 100K in compliance grants to people that are sole proprietors, so people that did not take on major partners. So these are like 100% ownership equity applicants. They get access to 100K in grants, in grant money. Whereas the other folks that did take on partnerships, because we also understood that if they had access to more financial abundance, that they may have not made the agreements that they would have made with the partners that they chose to take on. So we have like grants for 49K. And for people that are rolling out social equity programs, like please, like in building it, like please put in the financial side and like the access to that before we roll it out, because doing it like in parallel or like after the fact creates a whole different landscape that is harmful, really, and so being critical of our programs, we have to be honest about that. Like I said, I sit on the Cannabis Oversight Committee, but as an equity applicant, and I actually don't qualify for any of the grants, because I don't have anything in the pipeline. I couldn't find, like my brother was able to find property and everything, and he made his decisions of what partners he wanted to take on. But as a woman, like I didn't want to be in toxic male environments, right? I didn't want to have, I wanted that option to like not have to have that be my everyday, to have to navigate, like masculinity in a way that is very oppressive to my beingness, so I had to make some decisions. And I'm seeing some abundance because like I started a brand, but that's only because I got with a whole bunch of other equity applicants that didn't want to have that either, and we organized together. So in all honesty, like, again, the regulators are people, the people that are in the departments are just people, and we're just people. And it's the amount that we can organize together and get on the same messaging that we'll see any success in what we are doing. We're collectivizing with like 3 or 4 other equity brands here in San Francisco to create our own distribution company. The license holder we found was a queer woman who is also an equity applicant, and she held the distribution license but didn't have the ability to program it, right? Or to get it up and running. So for equity applicants out there, like that's what we need to do to survive. Like we used to have co-op language, right, in California to be able to organize and build our businesses. When they switched the language to corporate language, like everybody started fighting over percentages that didn't really exist. Like 100% of zero is still zero. You know what I'm saying? So like being able to think of it in a collective, in a co-op kind of framework, even though we have to work in corporate language, is kind of the way that we're being able to survive all of this.
So Molly and Shailene, if you could weigh in on us, what do you do, or how do you address a state, a municipality, a locality that says social equity is a set aside, unconstitutional? There's many states, and I'm with you, Shailene. We're on the East Coast, and so the West Coast, you guys have no idea. On the East Coast, they're more conservative. They're very narrow in thinking. How do you address that? And Shailene, I would love for you to weigh in. And Molly, you can talk about it from your now newly bringing it into your area. Those type of feedback that people are going to hear.
Sure, we talked about that a lot. At the time that we were starting, the decision in Ohio had just come down that suggested that straight quotas for protected class, specifically minorities, were not constitutional. And so for us, that was not on the table because we don't want to be tied up in lawsuits for years. So right. We were very by the book, step by step. First, we collected the data to make sure that our areas of disproportionate impact were completely objective based on arrests and convictions and other data. Then we collected the data on the industry. Then we did the legal analysis as to our authority. Then we did the legal analysis as to the constitutionality of exclusivity or equity programs or whichever policy we're looking at. Then we did public comment. Then we continue to take public comment and do updated data at every meeting. And we don't put an end time on these policies specifically because they're based on the data that we're collecting. And all
Sure.
of this is completely transparent. And I think not only is this good policy practice, but it's also a way to protect yourself, because it is really not easy to make a policy that, you know, helps one group of people over another. So you have to make sure there's a very strong documented basis for it.
We would love to get that kind of breakdown and share it with our audience afterwards. I think those are some really key points. Molly, your thoughts?
So yeah, I would agree with everything Shailene said. I mean, I think the biggest thing that we have to do, the first effort has to just be collecting that data, and being able to be able to build that program. And so that's kind of the point we're at here in Denver. And I feel really thankful that people are listening to this conversation here in Denver and in all around Colorado. And so we don't have to convince anybody. People are very open to the conversation and are ready to make the changes that are necessary. So, but again, we have the data and the information to back up our program.
Sure.
And then as we pull those details together of what the program, I mean, and implementing it and rolling it out is going to be a whole different conversation as well, right? Like we can have these conversations and we can come up with these ideas, but we have to roll it out and we have to get the industry to participate and support our programs as well. So getting through that challenge is kind of what's next.
Great.
Right. And I was also going to ask also to kind of piggyback on something that Kat said about the importance of being critical of your own programs and knowing where to celebrate your successes, but also realize the need for improvements. I think a question that I hear often is, what is the perfect social equity program that we should be looking at? And I think the answer is there are elements from each different program that are things that you should take as people are looking to implement these. And even Molly, like I said, for you, you've had the benefit of seeing these played out a lot longer. As you all look at like your current existing programs, like if there were one thing that you would say that you would recommend people should take as they look to build theirs, what would you say that it would probably be if there were anything at all?
So unfortunately, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think I really liked what Kat had to say around being critical of your own program. And that's something we're doing right now, is going through every single minute detail of our licensing policies with a fine-tooth comb and making sure that we're taking down the barriers and addressing, regulations are barriers. That is by definition what they are, but making sure that they are addressing a public health concern and not just there for the sake of being a barrier. And if they are important, making sure that we can, address those in a way where we're not, keeping certain communities out of the industry with those barriers there. So I think it's really such a detailed conversation of the different ways that you can look at your program to make sure that it's an equitable program.
I was going to also just piggyback. I do think regulators are barriers, but you can have barriers preventing people from moving through, or they can be lined up as a conduit so that folks can be shuttled in through a certain way. I am really critical of every program, mostly because no one has really hit the nail on the head. Everyone's starting from a different point in the Rubik's Cube. It's almost like we all got our own little Rubik's Cube and we're starting from different points. So how I'm turning is not necessarily how Shailene can turn in Massachusetts, but I can take little pieces of it. One thing I'm really excited about on the Portland side is what's happening with the cannabis tax revenue. So in 2016, the city of Portland voted to put a 3% excise tax on the adult use market that would be going to 3 specific buckets. And of course, there's always an inclusion of a public safety because of the canophobia. Therefore, we have to somehow beef up public safety when people are going to be using more cannabis. And it also called out the minority and women-owned, disabled-owned businesses. And it also called out the communities that have been most adversely affected by prohibition. In its history, this is where the critique comes in right away. We acknowledge, and the Cannabis Policy Oversight Team, which is an advisory body to the program and to the Bureau, we acknowledge right away, why is 80% going to public safety historically out of the cannabis tax revenue? And because of the backdrop of all of those racial equity initiatives, which by the way, Portland has had for a long time an Office of Equity. Portland has a dashboard that keeps track of all the equity things going on in the city. So you can mean well, but if there isn't someone holding you accountable, or if there isn't an oversight that has that authority to hold accountable, it could just be there for like show, but not actually be working. And so that is a perfect example with what was happening with the cannabis tax revenue. And the city council took the advice and heard the call that we all heard in the wake of George Floyd, and decided to divest what was going to the public safety police bureau specifically, and to pull it back. As a result, our program now has more funds that get to be integrated into our SEED grant fund. SEED stands for Social Equity and Educational Development Initiatives. Literally just named it as I started it because it existed, but no one called it anything. And one of the things I feel is important about the branding aspect is that there are a lot of people in Portland that are not part of the cannabis economy. They do not patronize the retail shops, but they did vote for that 3% excise tax. And so this is an opportunity for them to be empowered to support the cannabis industry, because their general political progressive views feels like, yes, the cannabis tax revenue should be used to revitalize these same communities. It should be used to improve the number of small businesses and Black and Indigenous and people of color own. It should be used in that way. So our SEED grant fund is not specifically for social equity applicants. And in fact, it's not specifically for cannabis applicants at all. It's really for the communities. It's for those neighborhood, organizations that have been underfunded for years, but have been doing the grassroots work on the ground, whether it's reentry, housing, work development, but it's also for any ideation that we can bring to the table that will help improve the communities at large. And so I love being able to have that fund, and I'm looking forward to continue to grow with it. But we did have to fight for it, and literally someone had to die for millions to see before they were willing to even hand that over. So we got to keep our foot on the gas, and we have to be, as regulators, advisors, but we also have to be the people who are like, listen, we're keeping you accountable. You can't just say you have an Office of Equity and you're not actually implementing all these theories and frameworks that we're building.
I love it.
Exactly. And as someone who's probably I think I'm the newest person in the regulators position on the panel, but I'd have to say that, I'm really proud of what Oakland has been doing, for the past 5+ years. And we're really grateful to have some people here in the city that's been doing, some really great work on the ground. Oakland, our regulators, commission, it isn't a paid position or a position where you go into, an office to work on this full time. And so a lot of this work was done even before I was in this role, along with people, shout out to, my comrade, Lanice Martin, who's been, leading a lot here, along with people, James Anthony and Amber Center and other people, right? So you don't have to be a regulator per se, right, to get involved on the advocacy side. For me, cannabis, it is a social justice issue. It's something that has been used to harm my community, right? And friends and family who are still impacted and affected by this. I also want to highlight for people who might be on the call, for folks asking about involvement and incarceration and expungement, to make sure that you research and sign the MORE Act. That's important as we are, going into, this election season. But for Oakland, I feel that we do need a dedicated full-time department that is working, on cannabis equity. There is talks, about that. One thing that I am really proud of, last year we were able to get the cannabis tax rate passed. So businesses that, make $500,000, or less can receive tax breaks. And I bring that up because it's important, because not only does that help equity businesses, but it helps small businesses, small cannabis businesses also. And it's a model, like Nina was saying earlier, equity isn't a cannabis issue. It is something that can be used not only for cannabis, but a model for small businesses in general. So here in Oakland, here in Oakland, we're talking about, economic recovery and helping small businesses during COVID. And they've actually been using that particular model in some meetings to help small businesses. And so as we're building our social equity programs, I'm looking at the general, right? How equity can help better all of our communities and be used as a model to empower small businesses and entrepreneurs. Because the purpose of equity programs isn't for people to be equity applicants forever. We have to make sure that we pass these policies so that people can actually grow to the next steps. To the next steps. And we also have some grants, like I was saying here earlier, that is going towards people to help towards manufacturing and equity kitchens. Also, people who are hosting and curating cannabis events can apply for certain grants here in the city, who fall under the category of equity in small businesses as well. But I know here on a local level, I would like to see more full-time dedicated departments that is working to better our social equity departments 365. And I also just want to take this time to thank Shalene. I know yesterday I saw on Twitter your role, your term is coming to an end. I don't know if you're going for another term, but again, as someone who is new on this call, as in the commission's role, it's really wonderful to be a part of this panel with people that have been leading the fight for social equity on a national level. And I would love to see more conversations of us coming together on a national level to see how we can support each other and learn from each other's programs as we're going towards federal legalization, because we're going to need to be more unified for that next level of advocacy and fighting.
Yes, we are. Shailene, did you want to make a comment I know your term? Yeah.
So my term officially ended yesterday, but I'm staying on for the moment as a holdover. But Commissioner Turner, thank you so much. All the other commissioners and directors and Madam Chair, Nina Parks. I think this is absolutely correct that we need to all be on the same page, both to learn from each other and as federal legalization is approaching. And for a closing comment, I just wanted to very briefly mention to people who might be watching this and thinking about how to interact with regulators, that you should think of it as a long-term relationship, because if you have credibility and you're a liaison to people on the ground and you're informed, you will make an impact, but it might take years, and as a regulator, you have like 100 things you want to do and you can only focus on a few at a time, but keep at it. If you look at Massachusetts, there's an organization that just formed called the Massachusetts Cannabis Association for Delivery, that was made up of social equity program participants who organized among themselves. They were so authentic, informed, prepared. They had their spreadsheets, they had their campaigns. And if you're thinking about how to be persuasive to regulators, it's a great association to look at.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I have a question that's kind of near and dear to my heart from a healthcare perspective, and it's for everyone. You can weigh in. How do we make sure when we talk about social equity, and social equity also contains the conversation about health equity, right? Because post-COVID-19, our Black and Brown communities were spotlighted of showing that there is a health inequity issue across the board, just outside of cannabis. What's your feeling, your gut feeling now with the medical programs, and how can we go back? And it almost felt like the adult programs came on board. A lot of focus went towards those programs, but you had medical programs that really needed to be updated. They needed more support, and more specifically, they needed to look at medically underserved populated areas within your states. How can and some of these social equity applicants come from those areas? How can we really go in and provide access to those communities? Because I think from a legalization standpoint, in the next 3 to 5 years, federally, it's going to go very strong medical. And if we don't have any type of play in the medical side, and if you as regulators don't help us to figure out how to open up that door back again, or if we lose sight of that, I think our communities from a health perspective get lost. So I just would love to get your feedback.
Yeah, I think for California, since we were able to get the compassionate care put back into the way that we're able to serve our public, that's really been a huge, huge help. So different businesses have been able to donate cannabis. They've been able to organize with people that have medical cards to get them free deliveries or really like reduced cost deliveries. And all of that came from advocates. And they were able to find a champion to help push that language through. But it was people organizing to business to be like, we've got these businesses that said that they would donate cannabis, and we have a system in which we are going to get it to the people, right? So looking at the compassionate care bill that went through in California, I think is a really great way to figure out how to get that to populations in need.
Right.
It's been major because people that have chronic illness are not going to the dispensary. And if they have chronic illness, they're probably not going to work either, right? So taking that into consideration and being like for the compassionate argument is like, do you want to leave people in pain? Like, is that our value as a society, is that we leave people that have illnesses in pain? You know, and like, since we don't have that value in California, we were able to push through, and it's been amazing to see people really take that. I mean, Cheney can speak a little bit on it too, because they have the Black Canna Joy box that also has provided that for folks. And I think that has been super innovative in a way that we were able to preserve what we once had in California as far as compassionate care goes. And just part of my own closing comments, and to answer the question that you had before, is like what things really work and that has worked, is one, for San Francisco, we had a combination of qualifiers, you know, for what qualifies someone as an equity applicant. So it was like 6 different things, and you were to like meet 3 of the 6, right? Because not everybody is going to fit into a box, right? And even in that, we wanted to open up it a little bit more. Something that we were able to include that I think is really important, because prior to my advocacy here, I was really big in public education as well as like after school programming. So to have as one of our qualifiers that you went to public school in San Francisco for up to 5 years, it was super important, because our supervisor at the time, Malia Cohen, she said that she agreed to put that in there to acknowledge that there's a real school to prison pipeline that exists for brown and Black students. So being able to have this overlap of social justice work and being able to weave it into the strategy in other areas, it was really important. The set aside of licenses, I think, was amazing that Massachusetts was able to do. But something that we were able to do in San Francisco, and it came very organically, but it was through the requirement that general applicants that wanted to cross from medical over into recreational or to adult use, that they made some agreements. So one of the agreements that they made is to create shelf space for equity applicants, right? So if there's set aside of shelf space, because once we have like products, we need to be able to ensure that there's place for the products to go. And brands are paying like $3,000 a month You know, like general applicants are paying like $3,000 a month to go get primary shelf space for, you know, for their product. But for social equity applicants, which has been amazing for us, is that we have found that there are agreements made by certain dispensaries. So now we can go to those dispensaries and be like, hey, it says that you're supposed to have 25% shelf space dedicated to equity applicants. Is that filled yet? No? Cool. Here are mine, and then here are the other 5 that we have. You know what I mean? To be able to fill that for you. And then something that I also think is amazing is that the 60% of California state funds goes into community development. So there has been grants that have been provided for mental health providers and other folks that are doing like substance abuse and have health initiatives in different neighborhoods, or that have been able to apply for those state funds through GoBiz. So those are, and also the shared license types, because if we're talking about reducing the barriers, right, the more that we can collectivize and not be like one individual has to figure this all out, really encouraging folks to create co-ops essentially, and then go in on the property collectively, you know?
Right.
Because remember, 100% of zero is still zero, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dashita or Kat, especially Dashita on the medical side, I know that question, and then you can give some of your final comments as well. Any kind of way we can make sure that we don't lose that market, and specifically make sure that our communities are having access, because I feel like there's an access issue, maybe not on the West Coast, but definitely on the East Coast. We feel like, yeah.
The access issue is pervasive, and it doesn't matter. It's coast to coast. As a businesswoman, this has been the most disappointing aspect, because I feel like there's money being left on the table. That's one. But as a cannabis patient, it's extremely disappointing, because ultimately, as I travel to do my job and work across the country before I took this post in Portland, it was basically me going into environments where I don't know what I'm going to get. So one of the first things that I feel like, and this was a mistake starting from 1996 in California, is that we didn't really take along the health professionals at all. And so I'm very excited to be part of the board of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. I'm one of 2 non-doctors on the board. And I think that what is really, really important is for us to start bringing in health professionals into the fold, because at the end of the day, like it or not, our general population still relies on the average MD, DO, the nurse practitioner to receive their, recommendations. And in this case, it's actually probably patients that are going to be educating those doctors more so than the doctors educating them. But it should be a conversation. And for Black and brown populations, that conversation is one that is very difficult to have, particularly if you have a non-BIPOC doctor. One, you're at risk of potentially getting child protective services involved, or having all sorts of other backlash as a result of just asking the question. And so a lot of the barriers are institutionalized. None of these like the American Medical Association, none of these groups are really interested in cannabis. Yet we all know at this point, based on what's going on in Israel, overseas, that cannabis is medicine, and it can be medicinal or it can be medical. And so I think the first thing is to reach us. Let us home grow. At the end of the day, I'm not a home grower. I'm not a person who's going to grow. I still got to go to a dispensary. I'm going to be real. So I'm not saying that for my own, but the reality is that more and more the trend for consumers is that we want to take our own health into our own hands. This is why the nutraceutical market has been blowing up. This is when I lean into sort of my understanding consumer products and recognize that consumers as a whole would prefer to just have that decision be personal. So first, letting home grow be in your market is the first thing. That means you're always going to have access in some way, shape, or form. So Oregon allows 4 plants. But then I also start to look at why, and this happened in Oregon too, why there isn't any promotion of the medical program. For example, in New York City right now, they're doing tracking and tracing for COVID. You're going to see it on every single billboard. Why don't we actually promote the fact that we have medical programs in our states? Why aren't we using the opportunity to re-educate? Because there's still a fear. I'll just let in with Oklahoma has really set the stage, y'all. We need to start looking at what they have done, because they have captured 10% of the total state as medical patients. And that's because they have no ailments. In New York, you essentially got to be basically dying just to get a card. In other places, the doctor is looking very specifically for the ailments that's been listed. And if it's not there, you may get a nay. And in Oklahoma, it really is at the discretion of the physician on what they want to recommend, which ultimately comes from a conversation and a dialogue between patient and physician.
Sure.
And as a result, their market is fantastic. They also, at the same time, have an open market on the licensing side. There are more than 2,000 dispensaries in Oklahoma. There are no dry spots in Oklahoma. When I lived in San Diego, I had to drive 30 minutes to go to a dispensary. There's no point where I'm not able to get my medicine. And I think those are the opportunities that we have in our markets, is to stop pretending that real science doesn't exist. And last, let's stop trifurcating the regulatory structure. Hemp is cannabis too. And part of that conversation and moving along our 55 and older, church going mamas and papas who maybe feel, and they're never going to agree that cannabis is okay or marijuana is okay, getting them in the conversation with hemp gets them that cannabinoid treatment that will help them ultimately without necessarily having to worry about all of the other negative connotations. Those all need to be under the same umbrella when we think about medical program and access and development of manufactured goods.
Yes, yes. Kat, I can't, Dashita, woo, woo. Because if you did not spit that out, Kat, I would love your feedback as well as someone that's been driving your program there in LA, but again, looking at that medical market, how do we make sure that we don't lose as individuals, those people of need, be able to lose out?
Honestly, I think that Dashita hit it on the head. The only thing that I would add is that I think that there has been an absence of education in different jurisdictions. I mean, I really haven't seen a consumer education campaign that I love.
Maybe I should do that.
No, and it has, people should be participating and contributing to these conversations. I think you do an excellent consumer information campaign, Roz, because consumers and communities of color and folks who are culturally competent need to be leading these conversations. And I think that we're still in a place, whether it's West Coast or East Coast, where certain leadership still stigmatizes cannabis. I mean, we have folks who are still saying good people don't smoke marijuana and calling people who use cannabis and other drugs junkies. It's 2020. That language is completely inappropriate. We have to use the right language. Our language is so important right now. And that type of language needs to be incorporated into a consumer education campaign that does focus on the science and that is intentional in the ways that it is directed towards communities who have been impacted. So I just want to say what she said. Plus, what she said. Plus, we need an educational campaign.
Absolutely. And then even, I mean, what's the thought about even from expanding the medical programs? Think about New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, where maybe expanding it where you have micro businesses for social equity on the medical side. And because I will tell you this, my good friend Wanda James. So Wanda, if you're listening, shout out to Wanda James. She said people have no idea of what it takes to run a dispensary. She says, if I had the opportunity to come in and run my dispensary under a medical program and learn metrics and learn all the stuff I have to learn to figure out how to manage it and to do it at a level that is not so overwhelming and then be able to transition to the adult side of the market, that's not a bad business model to follow. And I want to see more successes and more folks operational for long-term versus still trying to struggle. So that's just my feedback and comment.
And we also have to make sure that we are positioning ourselves to protect patients as we move towards federal legalization. Yes. Everything that Dashita and Kat said is 100%. One thing that I do want to add is that we're going to have to advocate to keep these taxes low, because they're going to use federal legalization to bail us out of this economic shitstorm that we're currently in because of COVID. But as we are all experiencing in our own states, is that our people are, of course, being priced out into entering into the space. But here in Oakland, there's an eighth can run you about $75, after tax, depending on where you're going. And so as we are And one thing that is really disappointing in this space, you know, I entered in cannabis as a medical patient. I use cannabis to, you know, regulate my my autoimmune disease and also chronic pain. We're talking about health disparities amongst, you know, African American people and, you know, and brown folks during this pandemic, and we need access to cannabis now more than ever. We're suffering with depression, PTSD, and
anxiety.
and anxiety and all types of other issues that are being heightened at this moment. And so we have to make sure that we're positioning ourselves to do the work where we live, to make sure that these taxes stay low. Also, that we're keeping our compassionate care programs accessible, because none of that is being centered on the federal level. Medical programs were not created to heal people. As we see on the East Coast and other places, it still is only offering access to people who have the money to get the medical marijuana that they need. And actually, it's not even access to the entire plant. It should be access to the whole plant, not half or portions of cannabis. And so we have to come together to come up with a strategy to keep our taxes low, so that the most marginalized people from a consumer side can still have that access to the medical.
Absolutely. Tahir, I mean, we are almost out of time. I think we've addressed so much. I want to leave the last thoughts with you, or any questions that you have.
No, yeah, we are. I just want to say for everybody out there, I'm sure y'all are in as much listening to these brilliant women speak. So I'm just really happy that we had the opportunity to do this. This is just the very first of many conversations that we're having, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to have been able to put this on, and for all of you all to have joined. And thank you to you, Roz, for helping me to moderate this.
Blessings, brother. Blessings.
And looking forward to doing many more. And again, thank you to everybody that took the time out to come today. I hope you learned something that you guys can take away to advocate for in your markets. And again, for people who are looking to be the future regulators or people creating these policies, that you also got some great information to be able to do that. So thanks again.
Hey, this we got to have a part 2 to hear. We got some more folks that we need to hear from, and we need to get this group of ladies and together again. So that's our push and our challenge. So thank you for having me, brother.
Yeah, we're definitely going to do that, and talk to y'all soon. Y'all be cool.
Peace.